There is something the avoidant did not account for when they created the distance. They did not account for the possibility that the distance would be met with something other than pursuit, that the withdrawal would produce, on the other side, not the anxious reaching of someone working to close the gap, but the quiet, settled, genuinely arrived at stillness of someone who is simply stopped. The silence that follows is not performed, is not the strategic deployment of non contact designed to produce a particular response. It is the honest expression of someone who ran out of the specific resource that kept the reaching going. Not the love, which may still be genuinely present in some form, but the hope that animated the reaching. The specific, sustaining belief that one more extension of warmth, one more patient waiting through the distance, would produce something different than what the pattern had been consistently producing. That resource exhausted itself, and the silence is what remains when it does. The avoidant registers the silence differently than they register ordinary distance. Ordinary distance, the kind they themselves create, the kind they are accustomed to managing within the familiar architecture of the push-pull dynamic, has a specific quality they know how to navigate. It has the empath's continued orientation as its backdrop. The management can run efficiently in those conditions because the empath's persistence provides the ambient reassurance that the connection remains viable regardless of what the avoidance behavior is producing. The genuine silence has no backdrop, is not the distance the avoidant created with the empath's continued warmth maintaining the connection through it, is the absence of that warmth. The specific, complete, this is not the same thing as the previous distances, quality of someone who is no longer maintaining the connection from their side. The avoidance nervous system registers this difference before the conscious mind has processed what it is registering, detects in the specific quality of the silence that something has genuinely changed, that the model it was running, the model that had the empath's persistent orientation as its reliable background feature, is no longer accurately representing the actual conditions. That detection produces something the avoidance system was not prepared for, not the comfortable management of distance they created, the specific, involuntary, this is different activation of a system that has lost the predictable conditions it was calibrated to. The fear that the silence produces in the avoidant is worth examining honestly, rather than with the satisfaction of imagining the avoidant finally feeling what they caused others to feel. Because the fear is not primarily the fear of having lost something valuable, though that is present. It is something more structurally significant than that. It is the fear produced by the specific, undeniable behavioral evidence that the model was wrong, that the assumptions the pattern was operating on, the assumption that the empath would continue reaching, that the connection would remain available in its previous form, that the distance was a safe choice with manageable consequences, were inaccurate. Models built on inaccurate assumptions are genuinely frightening to a nervous system that relies on those models for its sense of predictability and control. Not in the dramatic, obvious way of acute fear. In the quieter, more persistent, something is wrong and I cannot quite locate what way of chronic low-level threat response that does not have a clear object and therefore cannot be efficiently addressed. The silence is the source of that threat response. But because the threat response is organized around the model's failure rather than a specific identifiable danger, the avoidant cannot simply address the source directly and resolve the fear, cannot reach out and restore the previous conditions, because the previous conditions included the empath's genuine orientation toward the connection, and that orientation cannot be restored simply by the avoidant making contact. It was the empath's genuine choice, has genuinely changed, cannot be retrieved through the avoidance initiative alone. The knowing that they are done, the specific interior, this is actually true recognition that the empath's silence represents genuine completion rather than temporary distance, arrives in the avoidant through several channels simultaneously. It arrives through the quality of the silence itself. There is a texture to the empath's genuine silence that is different from the texture of ordinary non-contact. Ordinary non-contact, when the empath is simply not reaching in a particular moment, has a quality of continued orientation, The sense, detectable at the precognitive level by someone who has been calibrated to the specific person's presence, that the person is still fundamentally pointed in the same direction, even if not actively communicating. The genuine silence has a different quality entirely, has the specific, felt, this person is genuinely elsewhere texture of someone whose orientation has actually shifted, who is not suppressing the reaching, but genuinely not reaching, because the reaching is not the expression of their current interior organization. It arrives through the peripheral signals, or rather through their specific absence. The avoidant, who has been managing the dynamic, has been relying, however unconsciously, on the ambient awareness of the empath's continued presence in the orbit of the connection. The peripheral engagement, the awareness of the empath's life as it continues in proximity to the connection's history, the specific quality of someone who is not fully redirected, even in the absence of direct contact. When the empath genuinely elsewhereizes, when the orientation genuinely shifts toward their own life as the primary concern of their own interior, the peripheral signals change in ways the avoidant registers. It arrives through the quality of any contact that does occur, however minimal. The empath whose silence is genuine brings a different quality to any interaction that does happen. The specific, warmly present but not organized around the avoidant texture of someone who has genuinely returned to themselves, who is glad to be in contact but not hungry for it, who receives the avoidant's presence without the organizing hope that characterized the previous engagement. What the avoidant does with the knowing that the empath is done is the question that determines everything about what follows. And it deserves honest examination, rather than the optimistic narrative that the knowing automatically produces the genuine reckoning that produces the genuine change. Some avoidants, encountering the genuine knowing, experience the specific, clarifying, no longer deniable version of the forced question that has been described throughout this conversation. The question of whether they are willing to become someone capable of genuine, reciprocal love. Not the abstract version of this question, which the management can engage with philosophically without requiring behavioral change. The specific, urgent, this is actually what is being asked version, produced by the genuine evidence that someone who was genuinely worth loving has genuinely moved on. The genuine urgency of the question, the specific, this is not theoretical anymore quality of encountering the real behavioral evidence that the empath is done, can produce genuine motivation in a way that the theoretical acknowledgement of the question cannot. Not the motivation of loss pressure, which has been described as insufficient to sustain genuine change past the point of the pressure's resolution. Something closer to the genuine, honest, I have now directly experienced the consequences of the pattern motivation of someone who is no longer operating on the assumption that the consequences can be indefinitely managed. Other avoidants encounter the knowing, and the management finds its response. The reframing of the empath's genuine elsewhereness as their loss, rather than the avoidance. The narrative construction that converts the evidence of the empath's genuine reclamation into something the defended life can accommodate without requiring the fundamental premises to be revised. The gradual, efficient settling of the knowing into the background of the defended life as another piece of evidence about the world that does not ultimately require anything to change. The person whose silence is producing the avoidance fear and the avoidance knowing is not managing the silence as a strategy. That has been said in various forms throughout this conversation, and it bears saying again in this context, because the framing of the title, "Your silence is scaring the avoidant," can imply that the silence is a tool being deployed for effect. The genuine silence is not a tool, is not the deliberate withholding of the empath's presence for the purpose of producing the avoidance fear, is the honest expression of someone who has genuinely arrived at the end of the reaching, who has nothing left to reach with, or who has redirected what they have toward their own genuine life, or both. That genuineness is precisely what makes it register differently than managed silence would register. The avoidance system detects genuineness versus performance with considerable accuracy at the precognitive level. Managed silence, the strategic withholding of contact, maintains the organization around the avoidant as its primary concern. Genuine silence, the honest expression of someone whose primary concern has genuinely shifted, communicates that shift in the specific quality of what is and is not present. The avoidant knows the difference, knows at the level where genuine knowing occurs, before the conscious mind provides the interpretation, that this is the genuine article, that the empath is not performing non-contact, is actually elsewhere, is actually done, in the specific sense of no longer organized around the connection as the primary concern of their interior. And that knowing is precisely what scares them. Not the absence of contact, which they have historically managed with considerable efficiency. The genuine absence of the empath's interior orientation, which is something the management was not designed to manage, because the management was not designed for conditions in which the other person has genuinely, non-strategically, not as a move, returned to themselves. The scaring is real, and it produces something in the avoidance interior that is worth naming honestly. It produces the most direct available contact with what the pattern actually costs, not the theoretical acknowledgement of the cost. The direct, experiential, this is what it actually feels like to have arrived at this consequence, contact with what the pattern's choices have produced. The empath is done. The connection is genuinely different than it was. The previous conditions, in which the avoidance management was running against the backdrop of the empath's persistent, genuine orientation, are genuinely gone. And the avoidant is in the unmediated experience of what the pattern produces when the other person's compensating investment is no longer available. What it produces is the defended life, the self-sufficiency, the independence, the managed, controlled, not pressing against anything genuinely defended conditions of a life organized around the prevention of genuine intimacy. Which turns out, in the direct experience of it, following genuine contact with someone who was simply and completely themselves, to be considerably less adequate than the self-sufficiency narrative was claiming. The scaring is the defended life revealing, in the direct experiential contrast with what was genuinely present in the connection, that it was never as complete as advertised. The person whose genuine silence produced this does not need to know the details of what it is producing in the avoidance interior, does not need to monitor the fear or the knowing or the specific interior event the silence has catalyzed, is living their life, genuinely, in the ordinary days that belong completely to them, with the specific, real, unperformed quality of someone whose primary orientation is genuinely toward their own actual life, rather than toward the question of what their silence is producing in someone else. That genuine primary orientation is itself the thing the avoidant is encountering, the specific, rare, cannot be manufactured quality of someone who is actually elsewhere, rather than performing elsewhere. And the avoidant knows it. Whether they do anything with the knowing is genuinely open. Whether the fear becomes the beginning of genuine reckoning or is managed into the next iteration of the defended life's accommodation is genuinely unknown. What is not unknown is the person's life, which is happening now, in the full, genuine, ordinary quality of someone who has chosen themselves completely and is living from that choice, without performance and without waiting. That is not the silence as strategy. That is the silence as the honest expression of someone who is simply, genuinely elsewhere, in their own life, which is enough, which has always been enough, right now. The silence doing its quiet work in the avoidance interior does not require the person's continued attention to continue doing it. That is perhaps the most honest thing worth saying as an extension of what has already been examined. The fear the silence produces, the knowing that settles in the avoidance interior, the specific disruption of a system whose operating model has been contradicted by the genuine evidence of the empath's elsewhereness, all of that continues on its own momentum, does not require the person's monitoring, does not require their awareness of its progression, does not require any portion of their interior resources to be allocated toward the question of what it is producing. It simply continues in the avoidance interior, on the avoidance timeline, through whatever process the avoidant's own genuine development or continued management determines. And the person is in their life, simply, without the portion held in orientation toward the avoidance fear, or the avoidance knowing, or the avoidance eventual response to either. What deserves honest examination in this extension is something that has been present throughout this conversation, but has not been stated with sufficient directness. The scripts examined throughout, the avoidance fear, the avoidance regret, the avoidance collapse, the avoidance going crazy, the avoidance bonding, the avoidance genuine remorse, the avoidance humbling. All of these have been examinations of the avoidance interior. Detailed, honest, psychologically genuine examinations of what is happening in the defended interior of a person who was loved genuinely, and whose behavioral expression of that love was consistently insufficient. And all of those examinations, however accurate and however genuinely useful for the purpose of clarity, are ultimately oriented toward the avoidance interior as their subject, are the detailed, sustained, careful attending to what another person is experiencing. That attending is valuable up to a point, the point at which it served genuine clarity, the point at which the accurate picture became available and the person could receive what happened, with the honest account rather than the distorted one. That point was reached. The continued extension of the examination past that point begins to serve something other than genuine clarity, begins to serve the continued orientation toward the avoidant as the primary subject of the interior's engaged attention. The honest thing to say about extended psychological examination of an avoidance inner world is that it can become its own form of the dynamic's continuation, can become the way the connection remains the organizing concern of the interior even after the behavioral connection has ended or transformed, can provide the specific, intellectually satisfying, feels like understanding substitute for the genuine elsewhereness that actual reclamation requires. Understanding why someone hurt you is genuinely useful. Processing the accurate account of what occurred and why is genuinely valuable. Developing the clear-eyed perception that allows honest assessment of the dynamic's actual nature is genuinely important. And at some point, understanding becomes the activity rather than the foundation for moving forward. The continued refinement of the psychological portrait of the avoidant, however accurate, however well rendered, becomes the way of remaining in intellectual proximity to a dynamic that the genuine life is supposed to have moved past. The person whose silence is scaring the avoidant, whose genuine elsewhereness is disrupting the avoidance model, whose authentic reclamation is producing the specific knowing that the empath is done, that person is not primarily occupied with the psychological examination of what their silence is producing, is simply elsewhere, in their actual life, with their actual ordinary days. The ordinary days, at this point in the conversation, have been described in many forms, have been named as the whole of the thing in many variations and through many approaches. That naming has been genuine and accurate, and the honest question worth asking at this point is whether the continued naming of the ordinary days as the destination is itself becoming a substitute for simply being in them. The person reading this script is not in a script, is in their actual life, with their actual Tuesday, their actual set of genuine people and genuine engagements, and genuine interests that exist independently of any psychological framework being applied to any dynamic. The psychological framework served its purpose, provided the accurate account, gave the honest picture of what occurred, and what the avoidant was actually experiencing underneath the behavioral presentation that seemed to communicate something else. That is the genuine value of the examination. What is more valuable than the continued examination is the actual life, which does not require description or analysis or the continued articulation of why it is worth inhabiting. It simply requires inhabiting. The silence that is scaring the avoidant is genuine. The knowing it has produced is real. The fear in the avoidance interior is authentic and has been accurately described. And none of that is the primary content of the person's experience right now. The primary content of the person's experience right now is whatever is actually present in their actual life. The specific, irreplaceable, completely theirs quality of whatever is genuinely happening in the ordinary hours of their genuine existence. That content is not the avoidance fear, is not the psychological dynamics of avoidant attachment, is not the honest examination of what the silence is producing in someone else's interior. It is the actual thing, the genuine work, the real friendship, the specific interest that genuinely absorbs, the particular pleasure of genuine engagement with something that is simply, honestly, worth the full quality of the person's genuine attention. That is where this ends. Not with more examination of the avoidant, with the person, in their actual life, which is happening now, which does not require any further analysis to be worth showing up for completely, which is enough, which has always been enough, right now, in the ordinary days that are the whole of it and always will be. The silence has been examined honestly. The avoidance fear has been described accurately. The knowing that settles in the defended interior when the empath's genuine elsewhereness contradicts the model, that has been named with genuine precision. What more words on this topic can honestly offer is the question worth pausing at before simply extending. The psychological examination throughout this conversation has been genuine. The avoidance interior after the empath's silence is a real subject with real content, and what has been said about it is reasonably accurate. The fear is real. The model disruption is real. The specific precognitive knowing that something genuinely different has occurred, that is real and worth understanding. But there is an honest limit to how much extending the examination of the avoidance fear serves the person whose silence is producing it. At some point, and that point has arguably been reached, more words about what the silence is doing in the avoidance interior become the continuation of the orientation toward the avoidant, rather than the genuine elsewhereness that the silence was supposed to represent. So, the extension offered here is not more analysis of the avoidance fear, is something different, more honest about what the silence actually is for the person maintaining it, and what that person's life actually contains right now. The silence is not primarily about the avoidant. That is the thing that gets lost in the framing of your silence is scaring them. The implication that the silence is relational in its primary orientation, that it is doing something to someone, that its significance is located in what it produces in the avoidance interior. The genuine silence is primarily about the person, is the honest expression of someone who has genuinely stopped organizing their interior around the connection as its primary concern. It is not aimed at the avoidant, is not producing effects on the avoidant as its primary function, is simply the behavioral expression of a genuine interior shift that would have occurred regardless of what the avoidant experienced in response to it. The fact that it scares the avoidant is the consequence of its genuineness, not the purpose of it. The person in the genuine silence is in specific conditions that deserve honest description, rather than continued psychological framing. They are in the conditions of genuine transition, not the dramatic, everything is different transition of a single significant event. The quieter, more textured, this is simply what is happening now transition, of someone whose interior organization has genuinely shifted, and who is living through the specific quality of what that shift actually feels like from the inside. What it feels like from the inside is not uniform, not the steady, clean, forward-moving quality of someone who has arrived at clarity and is living easily from it. More variable than that. More the honest experience of a person who has done genuine work and is living in the genuine conditions of what that work produced, which includes both the specific freedom of genuine reclamation and the honest grief of what the reclamation was reclaiming from. Some days the freedom is the dominant experience, the specific, quietly extraordinary quality of a self that is genuinely organized around its own life rather than around someone else's availability. The ordinary days, with their genuine content, receiving the full quality of genuine attention. the interests and the friendships and the work, and the particular texture of a life that is actually being lived, rather than managed around the question of a dynamic's direction. Those days have a quality of genuine nourishment that the dynamic's most consuming phase was not providing. Some days, the grief is the dominant experience, not the acute, front of consciousness grief of fresh loss, the slower, more reflective, honest about what was real grief of someone who loved genuinely and gave genuinely and received insufficiently and has arrived at the genuine completion of the reaching while still carrying the genuine caring that motivated the reaching. The grief of real connection that could not become what it deserved to become. The grief of someone who is done, in the specific sense of no longer organized around the dynamic's possibility, without being done in the sense of no longer feeling what was real. Both of those experiences are the honest content of the genuine silence's interior. Neither is more correct than the other. Both deserve acknowledgement as the actual daily texture of a person who is genuinely through the dynamic in the behavioral sense, while still genuinely in the human process of integrating what the dynamic was. The transition that the genuine silence represents has a specific quality that distinguishes it from the performed versions of moving on that the avoidant dynamic sometimes produces in people who have been hurt by it. The performed version of moving on has a specific quality of effort, of someone who is working to be somewhere they are not quite yet, of the deliberate construction of the elsewhere-ness through the strategic management of behavior and presentation. The performed version requires maintenance because it is not the natural expression of a genuine interior shift, but the managed production of the appearance of one. The genuine transition requires a different kind of effort, not the effort of performing a position, but the effort of genuinely inhabiting one that is still being established. The daily, unremarkable, this is simply what I am doing engagement with the actual life that the genuine reclamation is building toward. The specific, patient, non-dramatic work of someone who has genuinely turned toward their own life and is genuinely showing up for it, without requiring the showing up to feel significant in order for it to be real. That work is ongoing, is not completed by the decision to be elsewhere, is completed gradually and organically through the actual living of the elsewhere, through the accumulation of genuine days that are genuinely the person's own, through the slow, honest, this is simply what keeps happening process of a self that keeps showing up for its own life and finds, in the showing up, that the life is genuinely worth it. The avoidance fear, in the context of this genuine transition, is not irrelevant, but it is peripheral, is the correct location for the information about what the silence is producing in someone else's interior, in the periphery of the person's awareness, rather than the center of it. The center is the actual life, the specific, present, genuinely happening content of the ordinary days, not as the concept of the ordinary days being the whole of the thing. That concept has been stated throughout this conversation in sufficient repetition that it risks becoming a formula rather than a genuine orientation, but as the actual, particular, irreducibly specific content of this person's actual Tuesday, their actual relationships, their actual work, their actual interior, with its genuine texture and genuine interests and genuine capacity for the specific, particular, non-generic engagement with its own actual experience. That content is not captured by psychological analysis, cannot be approximated by the continued examination of avoidant attachment patterns, is simply there, in the actual person, in the actual life, available to be genuinely inhabited rather than described. The honest ending of this extension is not more analysis. The honest ending is the straightforward acknowledgement that the examination has reached its genuine useful limit, that the avoidance fear has been accurately described, and the person's silence has been honestly characterized, and the genuine elsewhereness has been distinguished from the performed version, and the transition has been given its honest texture. What remains is not more to say about any of those things. What remains is the person's actual life, happening now, without the need for further description or further analysis or further articulation of why it is the whole of the thing. It simply is. The silence is genuine. The avoidant knows. The person is elsewhere. In their actual life, which is happening right now, that is enough. That has always been enough.